Hello, and welcome on the Barricades. This is a podcast produced by Eastern European journalists and academics. My name is Maria Cernat, your host. With me, the co-host of the show, the Bulgarian-born Polish journalist Boyan Stanislavski, and the special guest, Mark Sleboda, being labeled the pro-Kremlin military. How did they sneered you on The Guardian, Mark? It was so horrible. At the same time, we do believe that Mark is one of the few rational voices to provide very useful information with regards to the war in Ukraine, to the conflict, the military conflict, and what's going on there. So thank you so much for being again on the Barricades, Mark.
Maria, Boyan, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the Barricades with you. And thank you for calling me rational.
Yeah, well,
sometimes I doubt it myself. But...
Well, let me tell you that I told you I am a media theorist. I'm not a feminist, and my interest in military discussions and military discourse in general and analysis is only due to the fact that I live in a country, Romania, that has a common border with Ukraine. And like it or not, we are all involved in this, and we face consequences of this continuing conflict. And this is why I search for people who were there and who openly discuss the fact that they have relatives in East Ukraine, like you told us in the previous segment of the show, and openly say that for them, this is the perspective, the personal perspective, but they also want to provide useful information, useful analysis of the situation there. Now, as I told you, while discussing a little bit before starting the recording, maybe my perspective seems naive, but I think the majority of people, and there are polls to support my claim here, are pro-peace. They don't want war. And I think the majority of people, Romanian, Russians, Ukrainian, want peace. And I think it's very, very, how should I say, I don't think it's a good idea to call these people naive for wanting peace. And I want you to tell me, is there a way? I mean, what would you do to maybe impair both army and stop conflict at once and bring people to the negotiation table now in Ukraine? Is there a possibility to do that?
Okay. So first of all, let me say first that Romania, of course, as part of the EU and part of NATO, is very much a party to this conflict, right? They're not an outside observer. They're supplying arms to a regime in Kiev that has state-armed and funded neo-Nazi battalions that have been killing their own people for the last 8 years and are doing it right now in the cleansing of Kharkov. So, and they're going to pay the economic repercussions of the West's self-destructive sanctions, economic war of sanctions, and the resulting energy costs on Europe.
Yes, we know. I call it the anti-Russian voluntary freezing. We are engaged in this. I know so well.
I'm not a big fan, at least in terms of domestic politics, of Viktor Orban, your neighbor. But on foreign policy, I think you have to admit that he shows a bit of realism and truth-talking.
Some flexibility, at least.
Flexibility, right? Pragmatism that is not seen in the rest of the EU at this point. And he said it wasn't so much a matter of the EU shooting itself in the foot as shooting itself in the lungs. And I think that is brilliant. I think it really brings exactly what's going home. Is Romania about to go to war in Ukraine? No, of course not. But there is a potential for an end game for this to expand, for Polish troops to go into Western Ukraine, all right, at some point in the next couple of years. So there's lots of rooms for escalation that are still out there, to bring the conflict. Moldavia as well is a constant source. I mean, I saw that the leader of Moldavia was just going to Romania begging for firewood for the winter. So, I mean, she's paying her own political cost there for aligning the country so firmly with the EU and NATO there. Okay, so I think you're getting into questions of not just philosophy, but sociobiology. And everyone polls and says that they are in favor of peace up until what is perceived as the country's core national interests, whether those are actually local and national or global in the case of the US, the UK, to a lesser extent, maybe Russia and China. And in which case, everyone is very quickly for war. And most of the American people will tell you for peace, even as at the same time that they support wars, interventions, multiple of them, usually at the same time, all over the planet. So I don't really place much belief in the sentiment that most people want peace. Yes, there are a few academics who are ideologically, fixated on the idea of peace. But those, I believe, largely live in a bubble outside of their own populations and outside of the world we live in. We live in a world of finite resources, increasingly finite resources, when you consider that we're actually destroying the world's ecosystem and planet as we're happening. I would love to be primarily focused in my own international relations studies on climate change, which I believe ultimately is a far bigger threat to humanity as we know it, and more importantly, the natural ecosystem. I would love to be much more focused on that. That was an area of interest in my studies at the London School of Economics. I was a delegate to the 2010 IPCC in Copenhagen, where unfortunately I played Cassandra again and correctly predicted that Obama would do nothing and nothing would be solved and no binding fixing limits would be, because of politics and human nature.
But I like to push back a little bit, because the survey I'm talking about was specific to the war in Ukraine, and it showed that with the exception of Poland, most Europeans wanted the war to stop. And this is the survey I'm referring to, and this is why I think that most people
I think it might be important from the point of view that, except all those things that they're asking us to do or to follow, which you listed out at the beginning of this segment, Maria, they're also kind of trying to compel us to cheer for Ukraine all the time.
Yes.
And it seems like they were only successful to convince the population in Poland, which is like which does have its own kind of
to end, but on what terms? On whose terms? Right? I mean, that's always the question. The leaders of the EU just said today, once again, that Russia must lose. Right? We heard the club-going, drug-taking, young, pretty Prime Minister of Finland saying the Russian people must suffer.
Oh, Sanna Marin. We don't know that if she took drugs, and
maybe it was just flour.
Yeah, sure. Right.
But what's important here is
we don't know that Zelensky.
I'd love a person that takes drugs that wants peace. I mean,
yeah. But anyway, the question is whether this is like, that's how I understand it. The question is whether those people understand what they're talking about, right? Like, because it's one thing to say to someone who's asking you a question to collect data for some poll, if you want peace or war, and normally I guess 90% of the people will probably say that they prefer peace over war. But then when it comes to the more concrete arrangements, like, what do you mean peace, like what, right? Then it's probably where the trouble begins.
Yeah, peace on whose terms? I think if you take a look at the scope of human history, you find very little evidence of the type of sentiment that you are talking about. We have had, as a species, a long, bloody, fratricidal history. And it shows certainly no signs of abating now that we have the capability in multiple ways to wipe out all of the human population and take the rest of the natural world down with it. When we talk about human universals, I think that there are human universals, but they're probably not the ones that are usually talked about as being true human universals. I think the most common true human universal is othering. I think that that is a characteristic of the human social biological condition. And when you take a look even at other socially orientated species on this planet, chimpanzees go to war and brutally kill each other over territory.
Yes, but not the bonobos, that there was
not the
bonobos. The
bonobos, not the bonobos, right? But there's always a few, isn't there? There's always the exception that makes the rule, right? Ants, wolves. If you take a look at nearly any higher socially involved species, not just humanity, there is a history of violence, and I think that intrinsically, that may unfortunately be part of the social biological condition. How could you disable the Russian and U.S. militaries? Do you think that if you disabled the Russian and U.S. militaries, that doesn't mean that only that the EU military wouldn't go roughshod where it then can, or that the Chinese military wouldn't, or that the Turkish military wouldn't take advantage of the situation? I do think that that's naive. There are every country, again, we live in a world of finite resources, of contested ethnicity, political values, and everything, and all of human history until now, and anything that is foreseeable, tells us that violence and warfare, however we might protest otherwise, is an inevitable part of the human condition.
And it also seems to be repeating itself, right? Because like when you look at the situation today, many people like to make references to the Second World War, Hitler and stuff like that. But then, fact is that it's much more, it resembles much more, I don't know, the summer of 1914 rather than,
there is definite, traces of that as well. And the ethnic, cultural, political conflicts of the last century are still being played out in Ukraine today. Again, with primarily Ukrainians killing Ukrainians, right? Because of, competing national identity conceptions in Ukraine. There was peace, and there was, a balance both domestically and foreign policy wise in Ukraine from 92 until 2014, fraught at terms. But at the same time, everyone in Ukraine was acknowledging, there were actual science fiction conventions regularly held in Ukraine to discuss the future Ukrainian civil war. Wow. That's the reality. Everyone knew where it was going. And when the Maidan interrupted that delicate balance by changing the political rules,
which could have continued for at least another decade, right? Or so.
Neutrality was written into Ukraine's constitution up until 2014, right? They couldn't join NATO, they couldn't join the CSTO, that disrupted that balance, but it's still at the end about ethnic nationalism, the ideology, the European ideology of nationalism, and the competing national identity conceptions there, and worldviews. When I was at the LSE, one of the things I did, for both fun and I think it's very much part of building skills. I'm sure you guys are both familiar with Model United Nations, right? There is a spin-off of Model United Nations, very popular in the UK and elsewhere, called Crisis Scenario. And crisis scenario is when you have several different competing groups that form the national security councils of the countries they represent. And you have a crisis scenario that is governed by the people running the scenario, and then they have to interact, through events with what's happening there and make decisions. And quite often, military, at least is a part of this, because it is a security. And I participated in them and then ran them, and I ran such a scenario actually for the London International Motto United Nations in 2010 about a civil war breaking out in Ukraine, with Donald Trump as the president of the United States and NATO and Russia entering on both sides. And I did that in 2010. But when I was playing in crisis scenarios, and when I almost always played Russia to my preferences, and I was granted it. Whenever I was engaging in a conflict with the US or with NATO as a whole, the very first thing I would do, a major conflict, right, a major military confrontation, is I would trigger what is called an ablation cascade, or theorized. The United States, one of the biggest advantage they have militarily is their satellite network in space, right? Which Russia has its own GLONASS system, which is second best in the world, but it's still a far second step down. Just like Russia has the second biggest military, biggest and best military, it's still a step down from the United States in terms. And that satellite advantage is actually huge in military terms, right? It guides all missiles to their targets, cruise missiles, nuclear missiles. It has implications for movements of aircraft and fleets. It's a very
But is it also thanks to this superiority, Mark, that they were able to give Ukrainians, I don't know, tips on how to take Russian generals by name?
Absolutely. Well, actually, that's greatly exaggerated. They didn't get,
okay, right. Yeah, sure.
2/3 of the ones they claim they did. But not only U.S. military, actually, Elon Musk has been devoting a huge use of Starlink to Kiev as well, which is, if I was Russia, I'd already be taking Elon Musk's satellite out of the sky.
Yes, this was exactly one of my questions. I mean, why don't they take down the satellites? Because it seems like this is a resource they have to both rely on, but I didn't know that they were separate. And now the second one, if the United States has an advantage, why don't they take down the Russian satellites? Because it seems like there is a major source of advantage.
Yeah, so if you take down one satellite, that sets a precedent, and then the other side is going to take down one of your satellites, and then one of your satellites, and your satellites, and you see where this is going. An ablation cascade just gets to the end game of that, and you detonate a nuke in orbit, the orbit that the largest number of satellites are in, near Earth orbit, and the resulting shrapnel hurtling through the atmosphere will wipe. It's theorized, right? This is all a theory. Will wipe everything out, everybody's satellites on both sides, and which would, of course, have the economic consequences of pushing us all back, the entire global economy, into the pre-digital age. Which is probably why it hasn't been done. But when you're in an existential potential third world war, conventional bordering on nuclear confrontation, it's definitely something that an inferior force would consider. But it is an end game scenario, right? This is why no one is bringing down satellites, right? Because where does that end? Where does that escalation end, right? That's why it's not done. So the advantage is simply endured for the moment. But if I wanted to paralyze not only the Russian and the US militaries, but every other militaries around the world, an ablation cascade is definitely something I would consider. Another thing I would consider is a biological plague that would just wipe out humanity and deal with the root core at the issue. Some type of zombie plague or something. Because let's be frank, if you took away the weapons from the US and Russia, it would just mean that anyone who still had weapons left would use them. And if you take away everyone's weapons, they're still going to be beating each other to deaths with sticks and stones, like we have done all the way through human history. Sorry, that's the reality. And
well, that's very sad and fatalistic, I would say.
Yes,
and it means that we are doomed, because we are never going to tackle the climate crisis or everything else by that matter, since we are engaged in this constant fighting.
Geopolitical fighting. Yes, I entirely believe that. Yes, I think we are doomed. I've already, as they call it in terms, climbed the Black Mountain, in that I don't believe that humanity can or will reverse course in terms of climate change. And every indication is that we're just pumping more, right? The EU moves its production to China and Indonesia and says, oh, we're producing less climate pollutants now, and still continues to increase its levels of consumption and everything else. No, I mean, and let's be frank, capitalism is taking us there to hell in a handbasket. But even if it wasn't capitalism, even if it was the Soviet, a global socialist economy, right, that was forced on the world, at gunpoint, which would probably spark a nuclear war to begin with, and just end it right there. But let's say we have a green, authoritarian, socialist society imposed on all humanity. The Soviet Union wasn't so environmentally friendly. And there is every indication that in the long term, that the sustainable footprint, of the total human population that can live on the planet and not in the long term with any level of modernity destroy the natural world is not very large. So no, I don't have any hope. I am 100% fatalistic. My biggest political characteristics are actually bitterness, cynicism, and fatalism. And that's why I don't call myself
another important disclosure here.
Yeah, I don't call myself a leftist anymore. I always refer to myself as statist/leftish, because I think that in order to call yourself a real leftist, you have to have a belief in people, and more importantly, the people as a collective, right? And I have no such faith in human wisdom or goodwill, either individually or collectively. So that's why
I still have it. Let's see how long it takes.
No, I don't have it.
Hats
Here
off to
I'm
you.
with you. Here I'm totally with you. I don't have any kind of faith in the people. I have faith in systems, so to speak, because I don't think people are good or bad by nature. I think they could be good or bad depending on the circumstances. And if you want to change people, you have to change the circumstances, not the people, because your fellow citizen Donald Cameron in the United States tried to do that with the MK Ultra, trying to take people one by one and put as many drugs and electroshocks as he could in them to change them, and he never achieved that. So the only real change occurs when systems change. You don't have to expect anything from the human race, and this is why I think it's so important not to keep faith in people, but in systems. And what would be, because I'm keep pushing for an optimistic solution here, what would be an optimistic outcome of the conflict in Ukraine? There has
what would be the best case scenario if starting from today? Yeah.
I don't know. From one side, Russia militarily and economically defeated, a powerful Ukraine with a Banderite fascist vanguard and underlying, as Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty called it a couple of years ago, state within a state, not Russian propaganda, but Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty called Azov a state within a state in Ukraine. That then joins NATO and the EU, and eventually Russia is either completely sidelined, subordinated, and broken up for resources, or just becomes a junior appendage of China on the other hand, which I would vastly prefer to being subjugated. I mean, there is no win-win scenario here. Not everyone can win, right? The national identity conceptions of Western Ukrainians and East Ukrainians are incompatible. And Humpty Dumpty has been pushed down off the wall in 2014. And I don't think that there's any way to put him back together again after this.
So it's either Russia's going to break it, like, I don't know, break the Ukrainian army. It's going to,
or it's going to break the EU.
That is the second scenario. So basically,
that is the second scenario, is a Russian military victory in Ukraine, or a Russian economic victory over Europe, which forces a Kiev regime entirely dependent on Western financing, military aid, everything else. I mean, right now, 60% of the Ukrainian budget is coming from the West, from you. You taxpayers in the West, right? On top of the military aid and everything else. And Ukraine actually, they expect you to provide them with energy, with gas and over the winter.
But that's interesting because they just said that they're going to be sending coal to Poland, which is because
what coal? The coal is all in the Donbass.
Yeah, exactly. That was pointed out yesterday by our, we recorded a segment with a Bulgarian energy journalist, Irina Slav. She writes also for oilprice.com, and she said, like, wait, how are they going to actually import anything or export anything from Ukraine to Poland?
Do you believe anything that the Kiev regime
No,
said?
I don't. Quite honestly, with regards to that, I think it makes sense to perhaps point it out that, when I try to sort of analyze the situation in Ukraine to the extent that, whatever is available in the public record, like, Telegram channels, official media outlets, and so on and so forth, then, I've developed this kind of critical attitude. Like whenever, for example, the Russians come up with some figures that, let's say, I'm making it up right now, they've lost 100 men somewhere, that I normally add 30% to it, just to kind of, keep a healthy balance, in my mind. But then when the Kiev people, send out something, I just ignore it. Because it's like 99% is such an intelligence offending crap that, for an intelligent person with a pinch of intelligence in their mind to even entertain it, like, for a while is a nonsense. So this is how I'm trying to go about it. I take it with a lot of salt, okay, whatever the Russians are coming up with, but at least it's a point of reference, some kind of, like,
Russia, the Russian government lies, like all government lies, but it lies by degrees, by percentage points, or by often glaringly obvious omissions. Right? The Kiev regime just lies front and back, left and right, up and down, to their own people, to everyone else, and they freely admit that they're lying at the same time. I follow both Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels to get most of my information about the war, because the media has nothing. The media has nothing that is useful until 2 weeks to a month after the fact, and then written in one admission in paragraph 6, beneath the headlines and so forth. You can actually find important confirmations in the Washington Post and the New York Times, usually several weeks after the fact, hidden, in between the lines and so forth, that, I usually then use to make my arguments, because, are you going to doubt your own side's media when they make, belated admissions like that? So that's an important part of what I do when I'm doing my media reviews. But if you have to be up to date, you have to be following a combination of Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels, and the Ukrainian Telegram channels are still mostly full of just nonsense propaganda, but they have to be read for confirmation. Whereas the Russian military Telegram channels are very willing to be not be pro-Russian side in this, but very willing to criticize the Russian military and the Russian government in what is happening, and much more willing to admit when something has been lost on the battlefield immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, and they also admit that it's a very cheap and annoying propagandistic exercise on the part of the Russian media to constantly claim that everything is going according to plan. This is, even for me,
but
it's just like,
no, even the Russian media doesn't say that.
No, I mean, but for the by and large, they do say that, like, you know. I mean, this is at least my impression.
They'll say that the government says that everything is going.
Okay, maybe. Yeah. But anyway, this mantra,
even Kommersant doesn't. You know, the Russian media. I mean, they maybe the TV media, right? Maybe and so forth. But even then, it'll usually be in terms that Putin, you know, or the presidential spokesman says that. The Russian media and the Russians' consumption of it is itself in exercise in intelligent cynicism, where in the West they believe, generally the majority of people believe what they're being told by their media. Quite often, even at the same time, they say that they don't believe what their media is telling them. They will selectively.
But they will buy into it. Yeah, I know. That's a very strange. That's something which we've spoken.
We've spoken a lot.
We've spoken about that a lot. And for the end, perhaps, or I'd like to ask, since we spoke, you know, in those kind of philosophical, sociological terms, and you know, we kind of speculated about various things. I just want to ask the following question, which I think many people in Eastern Europe are actually asking themselves, like maybe not directly, but this idea is sort of, you know, floating in the public debate, to the extent that whatever we have there is a public debate. But you know, it seems to be obviously a conflict between the West and the East, you know, symbolically speaking, right? And there is an increasing discussion, or maybe talking points are made like that, you know, the West will probably lose, but not so much. And I wonder what you think about it. Like, I haven't really made up my mind yet, but the West will probably lose, not so much because they don't have enough military, or because they don't have enough funds, or because they can produce enough ammunition, or, you know, all those things, but because, you know, over the past decades, the West has produced a type of society and a type of culture which is finding it increasingly difficult to bear the smallest type of discomfort, like, you know, and that we have become in the West, including, you know, people in Poland and Romania, and, you know, that's what they're trying to teach us, at least that's what they've been trying to teach us for the last 30 years, is to consume and to take certain things like your TV, like your Netflix, like your, you know, popcorn, McDonald's, iPhones, for granted that it's out there. Of course, you have to make a financial sacrifice in order to enjoy it, but it's out there, it's for you, and this is your world. This is how it's always going to be, and this is the best of all worlds that you can live in. And if you don't have Big Mac and iPhones, then everything crumbles, everything. And now those people not only aren't going to have their Big Macs and iPhones, but perhaps they're not even going to have electricity. They're perhaps not even going to have like hot running water. And, you know, for me, coming from Bulgaria, having lived through this, you know, horrible civilizational downgrade in the 90s, and which continues, by the way, you know, I'm sort of used to it. Like, you know, I can take it, probably, you know, my kids, my parents, you know, we've got a lot of experience, but people in you know, that are busy, you know, developing the 78th gender type now, you know, and this being their biggest concern, I just can't quite you know, wrap my head around how they're going to react to this. And some harsh times are coming. And, you know, all those people in the West are screaming at the top of their lungs, like, oh my God, fascism, this, fascism, that, like everything that they don't like is fascism or Nazism or terrorism or something like that. But, you know, now when the real danger comes, and we really don't know how things are going to go down, but when the period of real discomfort and suffering perhaps comes, you know, with food shortages and all the rest of it, I just feel that those societies could implode simply, you know.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, that's what I think. That's part of the Kremlin's, again, this political calculation. The EU made these statements that existential war on sanctions, their punishments against Russian citizens, Russian culture, Russian athletes, Russian cats, Russian trees, everything else. The Russians have to suffer, right? Because even The Guardian in an article admitted the last week that the problem is not just Putin, the problem is Russians. And Russians need to suffer.
It has been the problem all along.
Yes. So the sentiment in Russia is freeze, you mofos, freeze. That you wanted to make us suffer. Well, in order that we would rise up and overthrow our government finally. Well, that's the sentiment here, to make Europeans suffer as much as their political elites wanted Russian people to suffer until the Europeans rise up and overthrow their own governments. And it's a chicken race. And I think that the Europeans are a lot closer to this. It is just beginning. It is the beginning of September, and right-wing populist governments are about to be elected in Italy and Sweden.
Yeah. And moreover, I want to say that, with this level of energy crisis, we've spoken again about this to our guest yesterday, and she said, and I agree with this, agree with this in a sense that I had the same thoughts. She said that she had thought that we're going to get to this critical point that we're in right now sometime, late November, and we're already there. Like, so, and the kind of ideas that people come up in Europe, like, for example, the capping the price of gas when you have no gas. What are you going to? Yeah. So this is obviously a sign of, utter, irrational.
And there's a lot of room for escalation.
Oh yeah.
Because Russia is still supplying gas to Europe via Turk Stream, via the Druzhba pipeline, although that's throttled by Ukraine, via the Yamal. Russia could cut a lot more, and you're already in the situation there that you're in now, right? It could get much worse.
And it probably will.
It will. A lot of Romanians said, but we are kind of independent and we are not dependent on the Russian gas. But guess what? When bigger countries in Europe are going to be freezing, guess what? They are going to take energy from us, and we are going to freeze, and they are going to be well off, because this is how solidarity works in the European Union.
In the European Union.
It's not just energy. Energy determines everything else. It will cause a general economic breakdown. The biggest toilet paper manufacturers in Germany have all just shut down.
Yeah, already a month ago or something.
Because toilet paper, it turns out the process is very energy intensive. So now, on top of everything else, Germans will have to hoard and ration and import toilet paper from outside the EU, because everyone else in the EU is getting their toilet paper from Germany.
Wow.
Right? This is the type of spiraling economic failures that are coming down the road. And eventually that's even going to affect Russia to a degree, because although we are probably the most autarkic country, in terms of economic independence in the world outside of North Korea, a significant part of the Russian economy is still engaged with Europe. And if the Europeans suffer, right, that's going to be a less, income from Russia. And, this is a spiral down, right, for everybody. All right. And if everyone else economy declines, even the Chinese economy is eventually going to decline, because of, they're still largely export-orientated economy, right? This is
now they're going to be even exporting the Russian gas, because they're buying Russian gas, and then the European Union buys it from them.
This is not just in military terms, but in economic terms, in social terms, in global internet terms. This is a major decoupling, a major geopolitical watershed. We are all still in the minutia of the day-to-day, in slow motion, watching the world quickly change before our eyes, and all of our lives are changing, and we're kind of like the frog caught in the pot of water that is slowly coming to boil on the stove, but coming to boil much quicker than we realize. We're all in that.
Right. On this optimistic note.
This optimistic note. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much, Mark, for being here with us, and to our viewers. If you like what you saw, please support us. We rely on your help. Please go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebarricade, where you can support us by making a monthly donation. Thank you so much again, Boyan, Mark. It was a pleasure. So
and follow me on Twitter and on YouTube on The Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. And you literally cannot send me any money because of sanctions. It's entirely impossible to do so. So instead, give your money to these. Subscribe to me and give your money to these guys.
thanks.